Welcome to Historically Speaking. My name is Jayavardhan Singh, and in this podcast, we talk about everything that is history. In this space, I'm going to talk about how the state formation in Deccan happened. So, basically, we are going to talk about the emergence of a state in early Deccan, particularly the period of 3rd century BC to the period of 1st century AD. So in this period, what we see is that there is this process of a transition from a tribal society to a state-based society. So this is what we are going to discuss in this space. Now, before we talk about the emergence of state in Deccan, I think it is important for us to first understand that in the Indian case, there are two cases of state formation or urbanization that happened. So first was the urbanization or state formation that happened in the Indus Valley, and after the Indus Valley civilization collapse, we see that the second urbanization happens in the Ganga plains in northern India. Now, in Ganga plains, this urbanization is also accompanied by state formation, and the present historical consensus is that by the time of 6th century BC, states in northern India, particularly the Ganga Valley, the states had emerged. So in this process, what we see is that particularly when we are talking about northern India, now the process of state formation started with the Vedic period, and from Vedic period there is this gradual transition of the society from a tribal society to a state-based society. So this took a long time to evolve. So what we see is that from the Vedic period to the 6th century BC, this the period between these two periods was the period of transition. Now, when we talk about state formation, I think it is important for us to first have a basic understanding of the terminologies that are used. So there are two ways in which we can define what state formation and how the process of state formation happens. So first, it is important to have a basic understanding of what we mean when we talk about states. So there are two important functions which a state does. First is the tribute collecting aspect. So every state and the running of the state is based on tribute or taxes. So this the mechanism through which tribute or taxes are collected are an important part of any state. So whenever we are looking at a particular society, this aspect, that whether this society has mechanisms to collect tribute. So if this mechanism exists, we can say that there is some type of state that is present in a particular society. The second aspect is the emergence of hierarchy, particularly social hierarchies, where there are elites who are ruling a particular section of the society, ruling the society. Now these elites can be it does not mean that they have to be a king to have a state structure, because that is not what we see in different parts of the world. But the presence of elites is an important indication that the society has emerged, the state has emerged in a particular society. So this is the two aspects when we talk about state formation. So the state formation, the process of state formation itself is there are two ways to look at it. So first we call the pristine or primary state formation. So this is the state formation in which we see that, for example, in the northern in the Ganga plains, this was the process of state formation that happened was the primary state or pristine state formation, because in primary or pristine state formation, all of the development or transition is happening internally. There are no external influences. Then there is this secondary state formation. So what happens in a secondary state formation is that the internal transition of the society from a tribal to a state based society is happening. And apart from this internal transition, there is this also an external influence. And in most cases, the external influence is by a advanced society where the state has already developed. So this is the two types of state formation that we see. When we look at whether we are talking about the primary state formation or secondary state formation, what we see is that in both cases there are two simultaneous process that is going on within the society. So what we can say that the society has a dual characteristics during this transition from tribal to state based. So what is happening is that on one level we see that there is this disintegration of tribal relations, and on the same simultaneously we see that there is this emergence of social elites. So on the one hand, tribal relations are disintegrating, in which are in most cases skin-based relations, and on the other hand, we see that hierarchies are developing. So these two processes are happening simultaneously. So this is what we see. Now, when we talk about the whole process of state formation, whether we are talking about in the state formation in the Ganga Valley, or whether we are talking about the state formation in Deccan, most of the work that has been done on this is more or less influenced by Marxist historiography. And the reason for this is pretty simple. The Marxist had a great interest to learn how the society itself evolves. So what are the reasons why there is this emergence of social elites, and how this tribute collecting aspects, the emergence of property, all of these processes were important for Marxists to understand. So that is why most of the terminologies I will use in this space or in this talk would be quite similar to the terminologies which we see in Marxist works. So this, I think, we should keep in mind. Now, coming to the so we have already talked about there are two types of state formation. The first is primary state formation, and the second is secondary state formation. Now, when we look at Deccan particularly, we see that in Deccan the state formation that happened was not primary but secondary. So by secondary we mean that in Deccan there is this internal transition that is going on, in which the tribal society itself is evolving, and eventually it will become a state-based society. Now, during this transition, what happens is that an external influence is suddenly arrives. No, so in the case of Deccan, it is the Mauryas, the coming of the Mauryas in the 3rd century AD, 3rd century BC, or even in the late 4th century BC. So this was the coming of the Mauryas in the Deccan was an external influence. So this greatly impacted this transition from a tribal to a state-based society. So because of this, there was this external influence of the Mauryas, and we all know that the Mauryas had a advanced state. They had the state structures in the Mauryan society had already developed. So this advanced society, relatively advanced society, is in suddenly arrives in Deccan. So because of this arrival of the Mauryas, the process of state formation is accelerated, we can say. So that is why because of this external influence, we say that the process of state formation that happened in Deccan was a secondary state formation. Now, what we see that before the coming of state, there are no mechanisms of tax collection, and there is also larger political structures like Janapada like structures are not present in Deccan during the period of 3rd century BC to 1st century BC. So because there are no structures that are present, that is why we see that we say that the state has not developed in the Deccan. Now since when we talk about Deccan and particularly the period of 3rd century BC to 1st century BC, it is the Satvahanas who were ruling this part of the country. So about the Satvahanas, so this is a tangent, but I think it is important to have a basic understanding of the chronology of the Satvahanas, because there is this debate among scholars and historians that about the chronology of the Satvahanas. So some scholars believe that the Satvahana period starts around 230-235 BC, particularly with the death of Ashok. The second theory is that the Satvahana period starts around 30 BC. So, there's this massive 200-year difference between these two hypotheses. So, the basic reason for this, these two theories is the fact that in the Puranas, we see that different Puranas mention different lists of Satvahana rulers. So because of this, there is this disagreement between historians on when should we say that the Satvahana period began. So this is about the Satvahanas. Now coming back to our main topic, which is the state formation in Deccan from 3rd century BC, what we see is that first we have to understand that during the Mauryan period, when the Mauryans have arrived in Deccan, what we see is that the process of state formation had already began before the arrival of the Mauryas. So it was not like that, when the Mauryans arrived in Deccan, it was only after their arrival that this process of state formation happened. So basically, this process that happened before the arrival of the Mauryas is what we call, the internal transition of the society. So, because the Mauryas, because in Deccan secondary state formation happened, so there was this, so there was the internal transition that is going on, and also the external influence which the Mauryas, influenced. So when we talk about particularly the internal influence that was going on before the arrival of the Mauryas, what we see is that in the in whole of southern India, particularly after 5th century BC, there is this demographic expansion that is going on. Now, how can we say that? First of all, the main question comes is, how can we argue that there was this demographic expansion in southern India? So we can say this because what we see is that post 5th century BC, if we compare to Neolithic, Chalcolithic sites or before pre 5th century BC, now these Neolithic, Chalcolithic sites were not as widespread compared to the post 5th century sites, particularly the iron megalithic settlements and black and red ware cultural sites. So these two cultures, iron megalithic culture and black and red ware culture, we see that there is this great expansion of these two cultures post 5th century BC. And because of this expansion, what we see is that earlier, most of the settlements, particularly these Neolithic, Chalcolithic settlements, they were situated on the uplands. But now, because of this expansion, we see that there is this, expansion from the uplands to the plains, to the river valleys, and to the coastal areas as well. So there was this, expansion. And this expansion can also be, we can argue that earlier, pre 5th century BC, in most cases, the subsistence was based on pastoral activities. And because of the expansion into the plains and coastal areas, now the society has, we see that there is this emergence of agriculture. So what we see is that post 5th century BC in most of southern India, the new settlements that are coming up are primarily agrarian settlements, and in most cases it is the cultivation of rice that is happening in these settlements. So because of this, these new settlements are quite different from the earlier Neolithic, Chalcolithic settlements, where in most cases it is the pastoral aspect of the society that is more dominant. But now it is the agricultural or agrarian aspect of the society that has come to dominate. Now, because of this expansion and the rise of agriculture, we see that the transformation is also happening in the tribal chieftain. So earlier, because the society was pastoral, and there is this, pastoralism itself means that there could be no, great hierarchies. But because of the rise of agriculture, we see that first of all, there is this rise of tribal chieftain. So the tribal chieftain now, during this period, because of rise of agrarian settlements, is now more powerful. And another important point which we see is that the rise of agriculture has also created a sense of territorial unit. There's this emergence of territorial unit because the society is now doing agriculture. It has become sedentary. So there is this rise of territorial unit. And another point is that since the tribal chieftain is becoming more and more powerful because of the agricultural processes, we see that from this period onwards, small localities are coalesced into larger localities. Now, this was mainly because of conflicts. So there is this expansion of, for example, one chieftain, because he considers now himself powerful and he wants to increase his agrarian resources. So what he does is that he goes and conquers a neighboring locality, and with this conquest his resource base has increased. So this process, which the coalescing of dispersed localities into larger localities, which we are seeing in post 5th century BC southern India. Since this society there are no written records from whole this region. What we see, some scholars have tried to argue, have used the Sangam texts from analyzing Sangam text, they argue that if this was happening in the Tamilakam region, most likely this process was also, more or less the same in the Deccan as well. So what some scholars have done is that they have analyzed some terminologies that are used in Sangam literature. So, for example, there is this terminology called Kudi. Now, I'm pretty sure that I'm pronouncing this this wrongly. So you should keep this in mind. So earlier, the term Kudi. So the earliest references of this term, according to some scholars, this term is primarily associated with economic base, particularly the herd and the extended family. So a Kudi is, in most cases, a Kudi means a herd and the extended family. So this is what Kudi means in earlier references. But later what we see is that now, the meaning attached to the term Kudi has expanded or extended. And now it implies not only the herd and the pastoral and the extended family, but it also includes clan, subject of a ruler, and even territory. So all of these terminologies are part of the term Kudi. So you see, from only referring to herd and the extended family, now these different terminologies are also associated with this term Kudi. So this, this evolution of the meaning of the term Kudi, according to some scholars, suggest that this shows that the society itself is transitioning from a pastoral economy to agrarian based economy. So now we should always keep this in mind, that this is the example that some scholars have taken from Sangam literature. So what they are basically arguing, that this process might have been happening in the Deccan also. So we should also keep this in mind. The major point here is that the internal transition is following a classical state formation process. So for what is happening is that first we see that localities, smaller localities are coalesced into larger localities, and because of this now there is this large locality, there is this increase in surplus, and because there is this increase in surplus, the power of the chieftain is also increased. So this is the basic, classical, what we can say, classical state formation process that is happening. This emergence or this increase of the status of chieftain can also be seen in archaeological remains, particularly the burials. So what we see is that in southern Deccan and Andhra region, there are burials which are called specialized burials. And what we see is that in these burials, these are megalithic burials, and in these burials we find luxury items like gold. So because of this evidence, it is clear that in this society there is this emergence of social differentiation. And most likely these elites, the person who is buried in these specialized in this specialized burials was a elite, and most likely a chieftain or a relative of a chieftain. Now, another thing that is happening during the post 5th century BC is that what we see that use of iron is also going on, and because of the use of iron, we see that there is this increase in agricultural output, because now iron implements are being used in agriculture. Then there is this also a increased in crafts production, because we all know that with the use of iron implements, one can increase crafts production. But we should always keep in mind that this craft production was at a rudimentary level. This society has not achieved a specialized craftsmanship. So we should always keep this in mind. So to summarize this whole internal process that is going on in post 5th century Deccan especially, we see that there is this emergence of agrarian base, because now the society has becoming sedentary. Then because there is this rise of agriculture, demographic expansion is also going on. And with the use of iron, we see that at a rudimentary level, craft specialization is also going on. Then what we see is that because since crafts are being these items are being produced, although at a rudimentary level, but because of this production, there is also a need to have a exchange system. So suppose one locality is producing a type of a pottery, and what we see is that some other locality is producing a special type of iron implement. There is this need to have exchange between these two localities, and in order to fulfill this need, we see that there is this emergence of a network of exchange. So basically a center is also developed where different localities are interacting with each other, and in most cases exchange of crafts item is happening. And because of all of this process, we see that emergence of powerful chieftains. So, this is natural process. One thing we should always keep in mind is that whenever we are talking about this transition that is happening in this society, we should not think of it as a, sudden process. So by this, what I mean is that whenever this transition from a tribal society to a state-based society is happening, in most cases, the society which is experiencing this transition is of a dualistic character. So by dualistic character, what I mean is that in the society which is experiencing this transition, on one level we see that tribal relations, although they are disintegrating, but they have not been disintegrated completely. There are still some tribal relations that is present. Now, at the same time, what we see is that there is this emergence of special ruling elite. So, there is this dichotomy where at the one level we have the tribal relations, in most cases that were kin-based relations. And on the other level, you have special ruling elite. And in most cases, so son of a chieftain becomes become the chieftain itself. So because of this, there is this dual characteristic. Now, interestingly, we can also see that this is the same process that happened in the Vedic period. So what we see is that the Rajan of the Vedic period was a tribal leader, but during the later Vedic period, what we see is that on the one level, the Rajan is described as the protector of the people. But on the other level, we see that he's also called the eater of the wish or eater of the people. So, what we see, so in the later Vedic case also, we see that on the one hand, there is this tribal relation that was there in the early Vedic period. So it is now in the later Vedic period disintegrating, but still some tribal aspect is remaining. And on the other hand, we see that the status of Rajan as a ruler is also increasing. So this process or this dichotomy that is present in the later Vedic society can also be seen in this post 5th century society. But unlike the later Vedic society, in Deccan something happens, and this was the coming of the Mauryas. Now, because of the arrival of the Mauryas, the state formation that is going on in Deccan suddenly gets accelerated. So that is why, this external influence of the Mauryas that is happening in Deccan, that is why we call the state formation in Deccan the secondary state formation. So basically what happens is that the Mauryas have control over this region, but they did not, developed a political organization, or they did not had power to collect tribute. The Mauryas and even the Satvahanas later they were mainly focused on collecting tribute. So because of their reliance on tribute was simply because of the fact that there did not exist any state mechanism. And because there is no state mechanism, you cannot expect that suddenly, because of the arrival of the Mauryas, state mechanism would be created. It would take time. So because of this, the Mauryas, in order to collect tribute, particularly natural resources from this region, they relied on political chieftains. They relied on these tribal chieftains who were in the process of becoming elites, but they still had some tribal elements left. So the terminology for the Mauryas and later the Satvahanas that is used is metropolitan state. So the term metropolitan state literally means that these societies had the states had already developed in these societies. So what we see is that these metropolitan societies needed natural resource from localities in this region. And since there was no social structure to collect the tribute in form of taxes, these metropolitan states relied on local chieftains to extract natural resources. Now, because of this, the chieftain itself became a vital link between the population which produced these natural resources and the Mauryan or the later Satvahana officials. So the chieftain became an important link, and because of this, the chieftains are now becoming a ruling elite. So this external influence of the Mauryas is now creating a ruling elite. Now, we have already discussed that the internal process is also going on, where there is this transition of a tribal leader to a local chieftain. So this transition is suddenly accelerated by the coming of the Mauryas. And it was after the collapse or retreat of the metropolitan states. So, for example, after the collapse of the Mauryan Empire and after the decline of the Satvahana Empire, the new ruling houses that came in Deccan were basically, they were earlier they were the local chieftains, and after the decline of the metropolitan states, they now became they emerged as kingdom in themselves. And another important point about the Satvahanas particularly is that we see that the Satvahanas, in order to establish their rule, they had matrimonial alliances with the local ruling elite. So these local ruling elites were the Maharathis. So the famous inscription of Satakarni I, the queen of Satakarni I, whose name was Naganika. So Naganika was the daughter of a Maharathi. This suggests that the Satvahanas themselves tried to form matrimonial alliance with the local ruling elite. And because of this, the state structure of the Satvahanas was decentralized. Now, another aspect of this arrival of the metropolitan state like the Mauryas and later the Satvahanas was the coming of new religions, particularly Buddhism and Jainism. So both these new religions had evolved in the northern plains, and when they arrived in Deccan, what we see is that these ruling elites, local ruling elites, they greatly patronized these new religions. And this patronage, according to some scholars, was at some level was a means to acquire legitimacy. And this legitimacy can be acquired by construction of shrines, stupas, or monasteries. So by patronizing these new religions or these monastic orders, the ruling elites, local ruling elites, hoped to have a certain level of legitimacy, because you have to remember that the society has not completely shed its tribal characteristics. So in order to show to the masses that these ruling elites were above them, they did not share kin-based relations with these masses, they have to have some type of ideology to show the different social hierarchy. And in most cases, according to scholars, these new religions and the patronage these ruling elites provided to these new religions, it provided a sort of a legitimacy to show that these ruling elites had a higher status. So this is what we see. Now, the emergence of new elites, and this was not a sudden transition, and this can be seen from the coins as well. So what we see is that when we look at the numismatic evidence, we find that the earliest coins that are found from this region, they are uninscribed. So there is no legend or inscription that is present on these coins. Then we find that the next type of coins that are found that are of a later date, they are inscribed and they have terms like Rathika and Bhojika. Now these coins are not widespread, and some scholars have used the term locality coins because these coins are found in small localities. And this would suggest that these Rathikas and Bhojas, they controlled a small locality. So, earlier we had discussed that how the tribal ruler, because tribal chieftain, because it has, conquered small localities, he had created a somewhat of a relatively larger locality. So because of this, so in most cases, these Rathikas and Bhojas, they were basically larger localities that were formed after coalescing small localities. So these coins are found in the second stage. And the third stage of the coin, which is of a later period, particularly the period of the Satvahanas, early Satvahana rulers. Here, what we see is that the coins have legends like Mahabhoj, Maharathi, and these legends on these coins suggest that now these local rulers, these local elites are aspiring for a higher social status. So that is why they are using the terms like Maharathi, Mahabhoja. And incidentally, the father of Queen Naganika was a Maharathi. We should also keep this in mind that these local rulers, they formed matrimonial alliance with the Satvahanas. We should also keep in mind that this process of the transition from tribal to a state-based society was not completed during the Satvahana period. And earlier there's this belief that the Satvahana had a unitary form of government in which the Satvahana ruler he gave a order, and from him there was this extensive administrative mechanism that was present, and the order passed from official to official and finally to the lower village level. But that is not what we see in the evidence which we presently have. And because of this, some scholars believe that the Satvahana period in the Deccan was not the period where the process of state transformation or emergence of a state culminated. It was a phase of transition, and it was only in the later period, particularly with the arrival of the Ikshvakus or Kadambas, that we see there is this, the process of state formation is at the level of culmination. But some scholars would say that even during this period the process has not been completed yet. So this is another matter. But we should keep in mind that even the secondary state formation that happened in the Deccan was not a sudden transition. It took around half millennia to complete. But it was relatively shorter than the transition which we see in the northern plains, where in the late early Vedic period the society was pastoralist, and by the time of the Mahajanpad period, it was only in the Mahajanpad period we see that state has finally emerged in the northern plains. So this is the basic difference between when we talk about the state formation in northern plains and when we talk about the state formation in early Deccan. So this is the basic summary of state formation that happened in early Deccan, particularly the period from 3rd century or 3rd century BC to 1st century AD.